To deliver the keynote, Racial Caste Redesigned, is no other than fellow South Central scholar Carlos Rivas. As rising seniors in high school, we've all taken U.S. history as a mandated course. No matter at what level we learned the curriculum, either at regular, honors, or advanced placement, we've all become familiar with essentially the same material. From Columbus sailed the ocean blue in the year 1492, and everything between that, into the present day. It was an extensive journey through 500 plus years of events that made America into what it is today. Looking back at it now, we can clearly recall studying the African to African American lineage and their role throughout the U.S. timeline. It is then that we realize that this group endured centuries of extreme oppression and inferiority. With the first record of Africans in the first English settlement, Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619, an African slave population begins and grows. They will be subjected to inhumane treatment and working conditions. Eventually, slavery would be abolished. In 1865, under the 13th Amendment, and nearly 4 million African Americans were free, as the history books claim. However, I disagree that slaves were truly free after that landmark year and pronouncement, and feel as though not many people believe the same because they associate their freedom with just being no longer subjected to doing involuntary servitude. Although some listeners are not aware and do object that African Americans were truly free because they were no longer under the dominion of a white master, and because the additional Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th and the 14th, granted them citizenship as well as the right to vote, I will answer that of course that may be the case, but really they need to be conscious of the fact that slavery and racial caste were just redesigned after the abolition of slavery in numerous ways to continue to infuriate the African American population. From slavery until now, new methods have been adopted in order to oppress and discriminate African Americans because their white American counterparts still hold an instinctive fear of other races and feel the need to establish dominance as well as a right to maintain a white majority. Immediately after 1865, when African Americans were free and granted their American rights, laws of black codes were set in place to restrict these civil rights and liberties. About 10 years later, indentured servitude, or slavery, a previous racial caste, would be redesigned into a new racial caste known as Jim Crow. Considered more than just stern black laws, anti-black laws, Jim Crow was a way of life, in that generations of African Americans were racially segregated from 1877 to around 1965 under the doctrine separate but equal. But were ultimately living under inferior and underfunded conditions compared to their white American counterparts. The objective of Jim Crow was to, again, restrict these civil rights and liberties, and for African Americans to use separate facilities that were nowhere equal to conditions of the whites-only facilities. After Jim Crow and segregation were put an end to by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the U.S. declared the war on drugs in 1971, after President Richard Nixon declared substance abuse as public enemy number one. As expressed by Nixon's domestic affairs advisor, John Earl Richmond, Nixon's administration had one of two enemies, that one being black people. They weren't able to make being black illegal, but to make society adopt the notion that narcotics were associated with black people would allow them to ultimately portray them as menaces to society, which would ultimately allow for the mass incarceration of African Americans easier, thus making it easy to associate all blacks as criminals and destroy their communities. Since the war on drugs was declared around 40 years ago, the incarceration rate in the U.S. has shot up drastically 800%. The U.S. now possesses the highest incarceration rate in the world, with up to 2.2 million Americans now in jail. Half of those are convicted for drug offenses. and the majority of those convicted for drug offenses are African Americans. Not considering those in prison for non-drug offenses, there are a lot more African Americans in the system because the war on drugs is succeeding in its hidden agenda. With more and more African Americans being labeled as felons, felon disenfranchisement becomes their new reality. Due to committing a felony, they lose their right to vote. But that's not all. Felon disenfranchisement results in collateral damage, if you will, on one's life. Being labeled a felon results in the same discrimination that existed during slavery and Jim Crow, which were discrimination in employment, making it virtually impossible to be hired for a job, in housing, education, and even being excluded from public benefits such as welfare. One is excluded from nearly all walks of life and disregarded by society because of this. Essentially, the war on drugs is the modern redesigned racial caste stemming from slavery and Jim Crow, to allow legal discrimination on African Americans not because they are black, but because they are criminals who just so happen to be black. Labeling the entire African American population as felons would allow for the same discrimination and restrictions on civil rights and liberties as did the Jim Crow laws did. Not because they are black or because we are prejudiced towards black people, but because we are prejudiced towards criminals who coincidentally are black. It is crucially important that every American is aware of the history of regulating African Americans to a subordinate status quo, because virtually nothing has changed for the typical African American since they were introduced to colonial America. This is alarming because it indicates that nothing will ever change for them. It makes being black very difficult and very dangerous because the laws are being designed to simulate the same discrimination from centuries before. Understanding the history of hate allows for people to think twice when supporting this next law because its true motive is already known, and it also creates the potential of such law not being passed. So I'd like to end with, modern slaves are not in chains. They are behind bars and possess criminal track records. Thank you.